Hello, welcome. We're going to get started here. Thanks for coming and showing up. My name is Cory Sims. I'm going to be moderating the panel for the next 45 minutes. I am the managing director of CES Music Group. We're a music consulting firm that works with B2B music technology companies and how they work with rights holders, publishers, and labels. My work involves strategy, business development, and how products and services can fit into the rights holders ecosystem. But let me introduce some of the panelists today. The first one is Jessica Powell. She is the CEO and co-founder of Audioshake, which is an AI music sound source separation company. So they can separate dialogue and other audio for new use cases across music, film, dubbing, and other industries. They are the winner of the Sony Demixing Challenge and called the cleanest stem separation by DJ Mag. Audioshake is used widely across the music industry, from major labels to indies, through publishers and artists. Jessica has spent over a decade at Google, where she sat on the company's management team, reporting to the CEO. She began her career at CSAC, not the American one, but the International Society of Authors and Composers in Paris. I don't even know if I pronounced that right.
I think in English they might say it differently, but in French you say CSAC, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And she's an award-winning novelist. She's incredibly talented, and I've gotten to know her working together for over a few years now. And she is a former New York Times contributor and opinion writer. So welcome Jessica Powell to the panel.
Thank you.
Our other panelist is Grayson Sanders. He is the co-founder and co-CEO of the collaborative sync platform, Chordal, and LA-based music company Safari Riot. He began his career in classical music as a symphonic composer in residence for the NYU Symphony while working on commissions for the New York area contemporary chamber ensembles. He soon turned his focus to experimental media and co-founded an art collective called Idea Media, which was a hosted warehouse scale event right here in Brooklyn, fusing all sorts of different types of music and art and technology into one place. In 2015, he teamed up with his colleague Jerry and founded the sync agency and label Safari Riot, and shortly after, Chordal was born. So Chordal is a collaborative platform. Of course, we'll let him explain it, but focusing on elevating artists and opportunities around visual content through a revolutionary approach to connected rights and file management. So those are our panelists. I think everyone in here probably has an idea of what sync is, and it's when music is featured in film, advertising, television, and other digital media sort of platforms, and offers music and performers way more opportunities to have their music listened to and also revenue potentials. It also poses a lot of complexities through rights and rights management, and licensing that's caused a lot of friction. So artists and composers have instead turned to other types of platforms through production music libraries, and it's been leaving a lot of money off the table for various rights holders and labels. So the explosion of content production has only exacerbated these sort of pain points for independent artists and rights holders across the board. So we're going to dive a little bit more into what these panelists have designed and developed through AI and different platforms. So let's get started. The first question, Jess, could you explain Audioshake to the audience and how it got to be so widely used for sync teams?
Sure. I feel like, at least, so for a long time, I've lived and worked in Silicon Valley, and like you're supposed to have these like great origin stories that are like changing the world and all this stuff. We started Audioshake, which basically splits sound. If we're talking about music, it splits it into its different instrument stems. We started it because we really liked karaoke. It was not some huge noble thing. We really wanted to be able to karaoke to all the world's songs and wanted to be able to do old punk and hip hop. And we lived in Japan at the time, and karaoke is amazing there, but the catalogs were limited. And so we were like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if you could take any song in the world and turn it into karaoke? So what started off as just a fun little project to see if we could do something that we ourselves could play around with. As we started to show it to our friends who worked in the industry, and we're all musicians too, but like not great ones, and certainly didn't work in the industry. And they were just like, yeah, your karaoke project, great. Have you heard of this thing called sync? And we hadn't. But we started talking to labels and publishers and learned a ton about the industry, and learned that a lot of the folks we were talking to, obviously it depends on their catalog, but for a lot of them, somewhere between 30 to 50% of their catalog didn't have stems or instrumentals. And so they were missing all of these opportunities to represent like the full breadth of their catalog. And so we built an on-demand tool where they could simply upload their track, and then a few seconds later get the song split out into stems or into an instrumental that they could pitch right away. And I think our first customer was Pure Music, and then it went from there. And now today we work with departments at all the major label groups and most of the large publishers, and tons and tons of indie labels and indie artists.
So early on, when you were talking to rights holders around this technology, what were some of their biggest like pain points around either AI or what people have tried to do in the past with this?
I think the biggest challenge we had was simply when we would reach out to people, they'd be like, yeah, source separation, it's snake oil, it doesn't work. People have been pitching us on this for years, and it just like, it's too full of artifacts, it doesn't work. And so I think our biggest challenge was actually just getting people to pay attention to us. If we could manage to get your attention and let you try the tool, usually then after that, people were super excited. The things that we would hear repeatedly on their side for pain points were certainly lack of instrumentals more than stems, though I think that's actually starting to flip a little bit. It'd be interesting to hear your perspective, but I think the first conversation 2 years ago when we were launching was just instrumentals. How do we get an instrumental? We would hear that a lot of just needing, and I think the other thing too, that at the time the conversations were all around how do we get an instrumental once the supervisor wants that track and knows they're going to work with it, and then we need to be able to give them an instrumental really quickly. The flip that I've seen, and again, you will have even better feedback on this than I will, is it now seems like people are wanting to give those instrumentals right up front and let people even work with them in pre-production.
So it's a bit of helping them on the demand side with getting the assets that they need sort of upfront, or as the sync or the brief is coming in, to have that all those assets right there without needing to go back and try to find them
Yeah, I mean, it depends, right? I mean, for a lot of back catalog, there just aren't stems because of either how the song was recorded. You get to frontline stuff, and more often there are stems, but you still have the issue of, the producer's hard drive crashed, or someone's just unavailable, and sync moves so fast that you need something right then and there. And again, I think that in that terms of that shift of letting people work with it in pre-production too, like if you provide all the assets up front, your odds are probably if you're giving the editor the chance to work and really imagine that song in the context of the video piece, like the easier you're making their job, probably the more likely you are to land the sync. So I think we definitely, I would say, yeah, you would say for asset delivery. The other part would be, I don't remember what I was going to say, so I'm just going to skillfully hand it to Grayson, who was saying something.
Though.
Yeah.
Yeah, Grayson, before you built Chordal, you with your co-founder Jerry, you had a sync agency, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And so, like, what were you noticing at the sync agency were trends that sort of led you and your co-founder to, lead you into this direction, which we now know as Chordal?
I'll rewind a little bit before that. So I started my career, as you mentioned earlier, as a composer. So I was actually like in the seat of the production studio, actually writing music, and had the fortunate opportunity to actually get a sync license pretty early on in my career. So probably 22 or 23, and that was the most money I'd ever seen in one place on the check before. And most of the people that I knew who were also like producing or composing or in bands at the time thought sync was just something that kind of just like fell from the sky like a Looney Tunes like anvil and just like falls down. It happens sometimes, like completely mysterious. How does it occur? How do you derive one? Who's in charge of this? And because of like, I mean, there's a lack of education for sure, but when we ended up starting the sync agency, we started it initially because we saw how, first of all, how effective it could be as a monetization outlet for music. But we also realized that there was a huge problem set that wasn't being addressed, and ultimately within like 1 or 2 years into running a sync agency, we're like, an agency can't solve this. Like a service-based business can't solve these problems. You're dealing with massive fragmentation and access issues. And so when you look at, when you survey the industry, you're like, okay, well, the music industry doesn't have a supply problem. There's plenty of music. We talked about this the other day, right?
Yes. Yeah,
There's
yeah,
so
it's a
much
great
incredible
point.
music made by real artists and composers that's losing out on opportunities to other types of music, right? And I'm not throwing shade on production music libraries, but we're specifically focused on the artist side of things. We really want to create solutions to elevate artist music and rights holders into those opportunities, because there's just a huge amount of opportunity there, but there are a lot of issues and frictions standing in the way of the access point. So that ended up informing why we did Chordal to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, with Chordal, what you have done, and I think I would like you to explain a little bit more of how you're bringing in the collaboration process and the sort of rights management to solve some of those friction points.
Yeah, sure. So, we're basically taking a little bit of a socially networked approach to rights management, which sounds kind of weird, but the idea behind it is that, in the last decade or so, there have been a bunch of tools that have come and improved the way people manage files within the organizations. Like, you needed to have your library somewhere in the cloud to share it, to pitch it. But those libraries are, for the most part, living on their own separate islands. So you have a lot of different rights holders and artists and songwriters with these accounts managing these libraries, but many of them actually share works. So the likelihood of one label sharing at least one copyright with a publisher who publishes, 10% is pretty high in a library of hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of works, right? And so from our vantage point, when we were thinking about the future where content is accelerating exponentially, we all know that. We know that music supervisors and people in the roles of finding music and licensing it, and ultimately also content creators, we'll get to that later, they have a difficulty actually accessing and being able to clear and license the music that they actually want to license, so they go to other sources instead. In order to actually solve some of those problems, we're like, we need to actually bring the people together who are sharing these copyrights together more effectively so they're accessible by the content industry. And so to get there, you need to build a rights management approach integrally into the systems that are happening at these rights holder companies. And so the way our platform works instead is we don't have any duplicates, first of all. So if you are a record label and you add a master to your account, and any other rights holder that shares that work later on, so maybe a rep in a different territory that you work with, or a sub-publisher that publishes a tiny piece in another territory, right? When they come in and they try to set up their account, we're going to tell them all the music that already is here from them, we're going to tell them all the music that they uploaded that's already on the platform and whose library it's in. They have the opportunity to then add their attribution, so their piece. And then from that point on, they're connected through a pipe, through that actual, that work. And so that enables like massive friction reduction and transparency, because you can share files that way, centralized, you can share rights information, and ultimately exploitation data and analytics. And so then when you get into the next phase of making this music available for the content community, they're getting everything they need in a centralized place, and everyone's in sync, for lack of a better word, with one another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on the content side of things and where the buyers are, how are you bringing people on to the marketplace to actually take advantage of this sort of centralized, rights structure that you've built with the publishers and the label communities?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's pretty silly and simple. Most people we talked to before building this platform said they just love to use Spotify to find music. And the one thing that they don't like about it is that it has 0%, aside from like the discovery component, 0% tools of it that help them actually do their job in licensing. So they can't get the access to the files, they can't get the downloads, they can't get the actual rights information or the rights holders that they need to reach, and the licensing tools. So we're like, okay, well, let's model their experience on the discovery experience that they're used to. Let's actually model a discovery experience that feels personalized and has a unified DSP type approach, while also giving them all the professional tools they need to actually do their job. And so most of the time when we've shared invitations to people who've logged on, they're like, oh, this feels really familiar to me. I can actually find the music that's useful for me. And I'm sure we're going to get to the AI component, but we're utilizing a lot of AI tools to leveraging a lot of AI tools to empower opportunity generation and recommendations. So
Let's dive right into some of the AI stuff that you have discovered out there or that you're building internally. Who or what are some of the AIs that you have incorporated into your platform, and how does that actually, improve the ability for either buyers to find the music that they want or to simplify from a rights management standpoint on the rights holder side?
Sure. Well, so fundamentally, all the music on the platform is auto-tagged with AI. There's like 19 dimensions of AI auto-tags that are injected into every single file. So that helps create a foundational search experience that's shared. There's also a tremendous amount of proprietary recommendations tech that we've built to customize the discovery experience for everyone that finds a piece of music they like. And then from that point, what are you going to do with it? As Jessica said, a huge amount of the music out there, commercial music, doesn't have the instrumental and stems available, period, because it's too old to have it available, or the producer lost the session, or the label just hasn't gotten it yet. And so we actually work with Audioshake, Jessica's incredible tool, to provide it in that discovery moment the opportunity for someone to derive all the files that they need in that moment to actually get to work, so they're not held down by that I guess wild goose chase of going around to all the people and finding out how they can get it, and they might not even be able to get it.
Jessica, where have you found the best part of your AI to be placed in these platform integrations with Chordal or other sort of platforms or partnerships that you see out there that really make the most, I guess, impact for people that are dealing with sync licensing, whether it's on the buy side or the sell side?
So you mean where have we integrated, or?
Yeah, where are you integrated, and kind of where, Chordal being one example. Are there others, though, that you are looking at where your particular AI technology fits into the ecosystem?
Oh, sure. I mean, we see ourselves as a B2B infrastructure company. We're not trying to pull people to our platform. We're very much interested in being where creators or buyers or wherever people are, they're doing their work. So we're really happy to integrate anywhere. Our broader work ranges, it's pretty broad, anywhere you want to make audio interactive or customizable or editable. So that can range from stuff that might not seem so obvious, like automatic dubbing, where you can actually split the dialogue, split the music, and retain that music so that when you end up with a localized video, you also get the music, through to stuff that's purely music. So everything from file storage and those kinds of spaces to Chordal, or in apps that are licensing music and want to make it an AR app, right, where you're punching the sky and they want to make the drum snap with every punch. So those are the kinds of places that we integrate.
The dialogue isolation for film and TV is actually quite fascinating, because I've seen a couple of those use cases. I think you did once with Doctor Who or something, with it being regionalized in a different market where they needed to strip out some of the dialogue and replace it with another language. So
oh yeah, that was the BBC show. Yeah, that was for to be able to localize Doctor Who in Germany. Yeah, they only had the original tapes. We do a lot of work with music supervisors or music editors. I'd say the bulk of it is definitely kind of classic, or what I think of as classic sync, where they need, right, they're the label is sending us a track and it needs to putting it in the platform to go to the supervisor because they need an instrumental. But there's also work where, for example, on the documentary side, where music is caught up in an interview, Maroon 5 is in some interview, and the documentary producers cannot afford to license that, and they need that removed so that they can actually just use the interview audio. Those kinds of uses too. We do work on that side. or people are using the tool in their workflow tools and doing those kinds of removals because we can separate foreground and background audio or multiple speakers or multiple singers. So anything where you just basically want to separate audio is where we get involved.
And you also have you're not only just B2B, right? Like you do service some of the indie communities. Can you talk a little bit about sort of your sort of direct to consumer tools, or if you do have any ways that, independent artists or labels can work with you?
Oh, sure. I mean, I guess I still think of it as B2B, but maybe it is B2C. Maybe I should learn the difference. I guess I think of it still as B2B because we're like, we have a tool called Audioshake Indie that indie artists and indie labels can use where they can just drag a track in and split it apart. And then off they go. The number one use for that, obviously, like people are not telling us every single thing they use it for, but the thing that we hear over and over again is for sync. And that tends to range from, I think on the artist side, people wanting to be able to get their stems so that they can submit to libraries. I think a lot of libraries now are not accepting songs unless they have the instrumental. I think stems are still not required at a lot of the libraries, but definitely the instrumental is. And similarly on the indie label side, other uses, I think on the indie label, more than the artist side, would be using it to get stems for, like to create Dolby Atmos or Sony 360. And then sometimes for, they'll be doing like authorized remixes or remastering or taking, like one that's very fun, like we've done a lot of work with like Mac Avenue, for example. I don't know if they're here, but with like jazz recordings. So they have a ton of live kind of classic, like Oscar Peterson type recordings that they've never been able to release because they haven't been able to master the audio. And so we're able to come in and like remove bleed and make it possible to really improve that sound. So we do a lot of work in live audio too.
Grayson, I think you mentioned sort of production music libraries, and we've seen production music libraries increase in their revenue over the past few years. One figure that I want to bring up was in 2022, Audio Network generated $40 million from, I want to say, around 200,000 copyrights. That's pretty amazing sort of revenue potential there. This is obviously part of the demand of content and the licensing that's needed. What do you think are some of the sort of takeaways that rights holders, maybe in this audience, on the commercial side, labels and publishers, can learn from production music libraries and sort of like the amount of money that's potentially being left on the table with not wanting to either innovate or improve certain aspects of sync?
Right. I think, production music has a place. It serves a need, but I do feel like there's a conversation that needs to be had around utility versus necessity, because production music, as I said, it has a purpose. There's some completely reasonable use cases and many instances where production music is exactly what fits the bill creatively. But for the most part, when you talk to people who are working on their own videos from the content creator level all the way up to the enterprise people supervising network shows, they're concerned about, first of all, for the most part, they want really interesting creative. They want to use the song that they want to use, the song that they love. If it seems too complicated, too slow, or too expensive, then they go to something like a sound-alike. What we're really particularly interested in is how to be a market force that's pushing back against that. Not necessarily from a narrative standpoint, just saying that production music is evil, but more so making sure that there's a resource available so that people can actually make the choice based on the budget they have left, based on the time allotments they need, but not necessarily just because they're afraid of venturing down the avenue of trying to clear the song that they want to clear. So yes, I think production music has definitely risen. It's like meteoric rise in the last 10 years, just because a lot due in part to the increase of content, the velocity of content across all verticals. But I think that labels and publishers should be more open-minded and willing to explore the broad spectrum of sync opportunities, of course with copyright value protection in mind. But there, I think, are going to be more solutions available to take advantage of that.
Yeah, and part of that, right, is the complexity of the rights and you mentioned like it being so fractionalized typically on the publishing side of things, and having a network that can understand, from rights holders, there's a lot of mid and long tail catalog that I think is being underserved and undervalued, particularly in licensing, where how can we get that sort of music that more discoverable, right? How can rights holders sort of change their viewpoints on either different licensing models that can get that music cleared, or that can, give those artists more opportunities, right? AI, like we mentioned earlier, you can be really, it's all encompassing, but on the demand side, there's so much music out there, right? You take a look at any rights holder in their back catalog. There's great stuff in there. How can, I guess it's just like a general question for the panelists, if you have anything to add on it, but like, how could like a rights holder look at some of that mid or long tail catalog and how it could be just used more efficiently and, for sync licensing? Any thoughts on it?
First.
I mean, I guess my answer isn't so specific to sync, it's more general.
Great, yeah, that's fine too.
I mean, we see every week apps coming to us wanting to get stems, and at the same time, they're asking us, how do we get content like from labels? And these are companies at the earliest stages, or earliest to mid stages. And like, I think what's coming from the, like, I started off at CZAC, but then I was also in tech for a number of years. And this doesn't affect us as a company because we work with the industry, and we're not a B2C company. But I am sympathetic to what a lot of music tech companies, the problem that they have, right? Which is that they have this idea, they want to launch this thing, and they don't have the BD, the legal, the ops team, or usually the know-how. But even if they did, to be able to go to like 3 major labels, at least 15 large publishers, the PROs, some of the indies, and license that content, and then even if they did have all of that, people most likely wouldn't talk to them, right? Because most likely, statistically speaking, these companies are going out of business in 2 years. So doesn't actually make that much sense for a label of any size really to engage. Because you'll probably make more, you'll lose more money talking to them, right, than the cost of like the BD person who's discussing it with them, or licensing person. And so I think one of the things that is, that I do think there's this huge opportunity, particularly on the indie side, is for new kinds of like turnkey sandbox licensing schemes that get people in the licensing pipeline really early and give them great, unique, like to your point, like great, unique content to work with. Because every single one of those apps that comes to us, they'll be like, can I get stems for this stuff? And I'm like, you've got to go talk to this label or whatever it is you're trying to do. Happy to give you the stems, but you obviously need to go do the deal and make sure all that's fine. And they end up going to usually the cheapest library that they can find because it's turnkey, because they can get all the things that they need. And to your point, like there's great use cases for library music. These apps that are coming to us, they're building experiences where they really want unique content, right? They might be like a music education app or a fitness app, whatever it is. And I just think there's so much opportunity, particularly in a world where there's now so much music coming at people, whoever the labels and publishers are, that are able to, I think proactively about how to get their music in more places and make it easy for people to use that music. I think the long tail and the opportunities there actually far outweigh potential downside when you're thinking about, like, I understand that there's value to, right? There's the value to being the Louis Vuitton bag that's not easy to get versus being the cheap version. Yeah. But I don't necessarily see these as mutually exclusive, right? Like the hand-to-hand licensing of a 6-figure, 5-figure sync deal, I don't think goes away just because you've made it possible for that song to be heard elsewhere. And I actually think that there's some interesting parallels between how you think about sync and how I think the industry now thinks about remixing compared to the past, right? Where we used to think it was like cannibalizing the original mix, and now I think there's a general acknowledgement that it actually drives relevance of the original mix. and longevity of that mix. And I think you probably would see similar things happening in sync if I can hear this great song in multiple places, right? So that's, I think the biggest thing I see is just, I think there's a lot of opportunity left on the table.
I totally agree. I completely agree with that. Also, I mean, there are, if you look at the UGC, the use of UGC library music in UGC rather, and you look at a lot of the genres that are being pulled for that stuff, I mean, there are, like, let's talk like your tropical house track that's used for a real estate video, right? They go get the library track because they can't get, the actual DJ who makes the track that they want on Spotify. Most likely, at least from our experience, most likely that DJ who made the original track on Spotify would be open to licensing that song for that little real estate micro license if their brand optics were not at stake. And so I think there needs to be a strong emphasis on how we can move the rights holder industry into the space of making their music more available for the content community across the entire scale, the entire spectrum of what that may mean, from the six-figure sync down to the micro sync, while making sure that people have agency to protect their copyright value how they'd like to. I think that's the critical piece. If you're basically telling this label who's spent the last 15, 20 years creating a brand that's incredibly bespoke and curated and cool kid, you're trying to tell them now that they're going to be shoved into a micro licensing library where they're going to be rubbing elbows with all this library music. I mean, it definitely smells of race to the bottom, and I think that's what a lot of people are terrified of, because it's going to remove their bargaining power when they get to the larger sync licenses. I think there is a middle ground to be had, and it's going to be required as Gen AI is coming and nipping at the heels of the production music libraries very soon. I give it, a few years. We were thinking 10, but maybe 5 or less. There are hundreds of thousands of cues being created on a daily basis already, and I think that is going to be putting real pressure on, like, the volume pressure on the rights holder industry. So we need solutions out there that are pushing against that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, looking at catalogs almost in terms of, like, I just thought of, like, the car analogy, right? You've got your Ferraris that are worth so much, your Mercedes, and then you got your Toyotas, and it's being able to look at the catalog and being able to sort of value it in different tranches, and also maintaining that brand value, right? Like, there are, these are artists we're talking about that have artist-centric careers that, have a different level of value placed on their music than music in production libraries. So that it's important. It's important to maintain that value if you're a rights holder out in the audience, or if you're on a platform like Chordal, to make sure that is that stays pretty high, right? And so that sort of is maintained through the entire process that we're dealing with here.
I think it's about maintaining control. Like, you have to have the next generation of tools in general. I think we're seeing across all spectrums of the industry are really orbiting around this idea of maintaining control and agency, and working with the right service providers, being educated about what they actually do for you, signing good deals, all this stuff, and it plays right into sync too. It's like understanding the tools that you need to use to expand your opportunity basis, and then sort of choosing your own threshold for how much you want to be accessing what tier of the market.
Yeah. Jess, do you have any thoughts on generative AI model and how it sort of, Grayson mentioned nipping at the heels of production music libraries, on how you see that AI coming into our ecosystem, and sort of where it might affect people first?
I mean, I think maybe this is different from what you're asking, but I think maybe there's some usefulness in talking about the state of things right now. So most of the stuff that you hear that is kind of getting called generative AI that sounds decent is actually not generative AI, which, who cares on some level how you get from A to Z? But I think it's useful to understand, because for a reason I'll say in a moment, it's typically stem recombination. So that those are companies where they are licensing, or they've acquired stems from composers. They might work with someone like Audioshake if they need to afterwards for the stems. It's all generally generally, I'd say kind of pretty above the board, meaning like these companies are actually typically started by composers, and they're using classic music theory, and they are recombining stems to create new music. That's the stuff that I think is the closest to library music. I think it still lags, but that is the stuff that will get there first. I think it then, because in part, a lot of those companies will use the label of generative AI because it's sexy at the moment, it then creates this sense of like, oh my gosh, this stuff is like almost here. If you actually listen to the state of generative music, it's actually still really far behind, which if I can take 10 seconds, just 1 minute to explain why, hopefully it's interesting to people. So like a couple of reasons. First, to do generative music, you have to do it in 44.1, right? Like that's incredibly computationally expensive. It can take you like a day to actually produce a good song. Second, you have to make minute 1 somehow related to minute 3. That's a really hard task in AI, right? That's actually much, much harder than, say, producing an image of a dog on top of a cat. I don't know why you would do that image. Sorry, that was a weird example. I just like talked about animals humping or something. But like, you get my point. Like, it's a harder task. The third one, it's actually really hard. Music is a lot more subjective in terms of how to explain it. So that weird image I just came up of a dog on top of a cat, you all can see that right away. And even if we could photograph what's in your heads right now and we'd all have a different image, it's actually like we'd probably be pretty overlapping. Versus if I said to you, make me a country song that sounds like it's sung by Taylor Swift and there's an 808. Like, what? Right? Like, I don't know what that sounds like, but I'm pretty sure that whatever we all would come up with would be pretty different. So there's a subjective quality to things like timbre and pitch and those kinds of things. Music is a harder task to describe in an objective manner. Anyway, I could go on with a couple other reasons. All this is to say, if you actually listen to the best generative music that's happening right now, Google's released a model, Facebook's released a model, I think Stability's about to release an API in like August or so. They tend to be really short, right? They can't go very long. They don't tend to be super high quality. Will it get there at some point? Yes, but we are still far off from that. So all the fake Drake stuff like that everyone's like, was kind of swirling about, like that wasn't really like 100% AI, and it definitely wasn't like soup to nuts AI. It was someone cobbling together a bunch of different AI tools and a whole lot of human in between. And I think that will be the state of things for a while, and that largely a lot of these AI tools on the generative side will be used as kind of creative jumping off points rather than complete total automation of tasks. And so that was probably not answering your question.
Brilliant, though. Yeah, it was
Sorry.
Brilliant discussion on that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Look at that.
It was the dog and cat image, wasn't it?
I think with my work with certain rights holders, it's really educating them about the different AI uses that they have, and that it's still a lot of. Most of it's human curated stuff, or like it's taking the AI to either become a little bit more efficient or create things that otherwise wouldn't be able to be created. But it's still so much human element, and I think we're still so far away from that fact that AI is just going to take over and replace. And so, anyways, we have a few more minutes left. I would like to open it up to the participants in the sort of audience here. So, anybody have any questions for the panel? Matt will come around and give you a microphone. Yeah, John.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on using some of these AI tools to create music for sync, and how that might make it much more complicated or impossible to license things, or any exposure for people trying to license music that contains things that were either generative or the cobbled together, remixed, hybrid, whatever that you were describing.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different slices of it, some of which I think will get resolved, and to the degree where maybe it's, I don't even know how much I should speculate on it, and then other things that I think are hard. There is a thing right now with the copyright board about whether like something that's generated with AI can actually be copyrighted, right? Like I think that will morph. Like I don't think it'll necessarily hold exactly the way it is, because like humans use AI all the time for all kinds of things, and I think the most likely output of stuff is not like, again, 100% AI, but people getting involved in little bits, and probably that stuff will end up copyrighted, and so we probably don't need to fret a ton about that unless we're lawyers and we have to actually like think about all the slippery slope and edge cases. I think that there's a whole bunch of different tasks that have to be solved. There's if you're using, I actually think most of what will happen is, people will use it in their workflow where, so an example I just heard yesterday from a label is they are using, they're playing around with voice conversion, right? So the same thing for the, that was going on with that Drake and the Weeknd track. They're playing around with voice conversion because when they get, what's it called, a pitch record, right? When they get one of those, one of the big problems, of course, is that it's very hard to imagine your artist on that song. So they're using voice conversion, as sloppy as it might be right now, to try and put the artist on the track, and then they can try and imagine whether it's a fit a little bit more. So in the same vein, I had a friend who needed some help. He had recorded him playing guitar, a friend playing saxophone, and he wanted to see what would happen if he got rid of the saxophone. So he used Audioshake to split the saxophone, and then took the saxophone and did basically used a filter on it and make that saxophone instead be Grimes' voice, right? And what would that do to the track? Anyway, the track was kind of
50% hers.
Yeah, exactly. And the track was kind of wild, right? It didn't work, but it was fascinating to him because he was like, I never thought about what this song could be with a female vocalist on it, and now he's like, this actually makes me want to reach out to this friend I know who sings and actually have her record this. And I'm a pretty crappy musician. I try, but none of you will ever hear me play, and I will never be on Grayson's platform, and you will never represent me. I'm a better writer than I am a musician, so I think about this actually sometimes in terms of writing. I've used ChatGPT a couple times when I hit a plot block. It's terrible, right? It's super banal. It's like a Hallmark card. It's regurgitated, statistically accurate words, one coming after another. You would never use it. But I was writing a scene about an amusement park, and I was getting stuck on just a description of something. So I was like, ChatGPT, pretend you're a writer and describe an amusement park for me. Again, terrible output, except it starts talking about a gondola. And I was like, oh, right, on the Ferris wheel, those things are called gondolas. And how do gondolas move? And how do you think about what's when they stop and they bob and all that stuff? And next thing you know, I'm writing about a gondola, not using anything that ChatGPT gave me, but it was a great jumping off point. And I think musically, very similar. Sure, create a Taylor Swift song or create a country song for me with an 808. I kind of want to hear that. It's going to be terrible, right? But I sort of want to hear it. And I think that, as a creative inspiration tool, I think there's a ton that you can do with it.
We haven't really had concept art as a concept in sync in general.
Yeah.
Hey. So one question I had is, there's been so much talk in the visual AI space of compensating creators whose images, whatever, are scraped to help make those engines, your DALL-Es and whatnot. Curious how you guys, how that intersects with the music space and these potentially generative AI tools, and whether or not creators should be compensated, what a compensation model might look like for, the Drakes and the Weeknd whose work is used to make some sort of generative AI.
Sure. I think, so there's a first piece of it is training data, and the second piece is actually the derivative. On the training data side, it's interesting. I think one thing that's useful maybe to say that I think everyone in this room knows, certainly if you're in sync and you're working with AI tools, AI is a very, very broad field. In a lot of ways, it's actually unhelpful that we call it AI. It's almost better just to think of it as software, because you wouldn't compare Google Maps to Salesforce to QuickBooks. AI, it's actually similar. What we do at Audioshake has more in common with self-driving cars than it does with, say, generative music, right? AI is just sophisticated statistics applied in very, very different ways. So if you're talking about source separation, like what we do, we actually don't have to train on Elvis or the Rolling Stones to be able to separate them. We can train on library music. We can train on stuff that we license. Open source stuff doesn't tend to, right? But private companies doing this kind of thing, I think for the most part, maybe I'm being a little generous here, but I think for the most part are pretty buttoned up in terms of on the training data side. If you want to do on the generative side, though, and you want to be able to do that Taylor Swift country example, or you want make me a track of The Weeknd and Drake together, you do need to train on The Weeknd and Drake, or you at least need to train on a sound-alike to be able to get that. And so that there, the training data issue, I think, becomes even more central to the debate and is very much, it's the same debate as it's happening with DALL-E and stability over Getty Images and stuff. And so it'll be, I think everyone in the industry is watching to see what happens with those legal cases, and then the same sort of logic will probably follow. I think the interesting thing to see, to me it seems like a no-brainer that one should be saying, look, if you train on something, we should compensate the people who you're training on, right? Like that feels like not, you don't have to be a lawyer to be like, that feels pretty ethical, right? I think the thing that'll be interesting to see is like, how does that intersect with big tech generally? Because if you all of a sudden say that the web is training data, like that has really far-reaching implications well beyond music and image, which for the most part, the big tech companies don't care that much about, right? In the grand scheme of things of their business. Versus you say all of the web is, like if you're saying you can't crawl content and train on it, everything that we do on search or everything is AI crawled content. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the companies respond from a legal perspective to that kind of thing, like the broader ecosystem responds. And the final thing I would say that seems a little bit tricky is that from an AI company perspective, it's hard for me to imagine right now what a model looks like for licensing training data, because to me as an AI, again, we license, but we don't need to train on millions of tracks the way a generative model would. And for us, each individual asset is worth like exceptionally little. So your song to me is worth like a fraction of a cent. And it doesn't actually matter that it's an amazing song compared to like Cory's jam band, right? Like I just need I need a diversity of musical content. And that would be true with generative as well. And so how do you say like Elvis, you're worth 0.001 of a cent? And so how, from the AI company, if they're just looking at these as assets, like how do you find a model where both sides see the value in that? I feel like I go on for 10 minutes about this because there's like so many different points to that question, and I've droned on too long, I'll
I
stop.
think you need a closed loop system where there's incentives at both sides. So speaking aside from the actual data set size, because let's say in a perfect world, there are millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of songs to choose from. All of those rights holders should ideally have opted in to this training set. If it's a transactional ecosystem where there's actually money coming out, I think the next wave of tech companies have an opportunity to get broad buy-in and create different revenue compensation models, probably more on the micro scale rather than individual, if we're talking specifically in sync, individually licensed pieces of music. But if we are talking micro syncs, I think there certainly is a way, and potentially a broad utility for smart contracts in that micro compensation of the artists whose music has been training these models that are otherwise making these possible. So I think it's possible, but you need input and output to drive the incentive, and it's going to be hard if you're just crawling the internet.
And I think also if you don't have, I do think that everything is kind of getting exploded, right? It already is happening. Yeah. It's just not happening in a licensed way, right? And I think that the sooner the industry can look at I know it's a total headache, right? Like particularly on the publishing side, like how do you possibly figure out the splits on all this stuff? So I don't want to like be flip about it, but I think the potential upside is huge. Like and I do think that particularly in instances where you can have creation and distribution happening in the same place, you actually can track those assets. And so allowing people, again, you would have the artists that don't want to be involved at all. But that exists today with like YouTube and everything, right? Like that sort of paradigm exists. And so you could have the same thing where artists that don't want to be involved don't have to be involved. Yeah. But allowing people to create and recreate and interact and throw themselves into the music, like that's what fans want to do. And I think there's a huge amount of financial like opportunity there for when, because I think it will happen at some point when the industry gets there.
Great. Matt, do we have time for one more question, or should we wrap? One more? Okay, great.
We talk a lot about like sound recording and publishing, you need to license it and for training, whatever. Do you think we need an additional biodata consensus by the artists when your vocal has been used for Gen AI, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it probably depends a little bit on the legal framework and what the country, right? Like there's likeness rights in the US, the same time there are other countries where that doesn't exist. But putting all that kind of stuff aside, I mean, it seems to me just on the most human level, to me, like the human voice feels like an incredibly intimate thing. And I think it feels very private, and hearing their words, like hearing their voice saying things that they didn't say, I think is like a pretty invasive thing. And I think in a lot of other contexts, like we're pretty harsh from a societal point of view on like political deepfakes, which granted, I do not think are the same, like, in fairness, I think they are more serious than like a parody cover, you know? But I think we should be respectful, like we have to keep in mind that this, I don't think it's an entire, like I've heard some people say like the song deep fakes are essentially the same thing as the new version of remixes. I think there are some parallels in that, but I think we have to be super mindful of just artist wishes and the fact that like it feels even more invasive probably to some artists than say you simply like taking a sample from their work and then recontextualizing it in a new work. So yeah.
Great. Well, I think that we'll close out this panel. So thank you everyone for attending, and thanks to our brilliant and smart panelists. If you have any questions, we'll be probably over there. All right, thanks.